So now we're going to talk just a little bit about rulemaking in the regulatory process. There are so many ways that rules can be made. You can have Congress pass up something to the executive branch. You can have an independent commission try to use rulemaking through an Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. They can propose a rule, they can make public comments, they can do final rules, codes of regulations. The executive branch can propose rules directly to executive agencies. And of course, when all that's going on, the federal courts need to review everything and make sure it's not violating the Constitution. So you've got a whole lot of moving pieces. You won't be a master of rulemaking or the regulatory process just by watching this video. We're only trying to give you kind of a superficial overview. Rulemaking is the process where regulatory agencies promote some sort of a rule that has the force of law. And a rule is some sort of a decree issued by an agency to implement a law that is passed by Congress. And the process of rulemaking is designed to protect the public from arbitrary and unfair acts of government. Now, when an agency decides to promote or pass a rule, it has to go through research, deliberation, and of course consultation with affected parties, particularly the electorate, at least in theory. When a draft is ready, the agency publishes a rule in the Federal Register. And the Federal Register is a daily government publication that contains all the proposed rules, final rules, notices of public meetings by regulatory agencies, and presidential orders. And pages in the Federal Register are usually seen as a crude gauge of regulatory activity. Now, in the Federal Register, the public can comment on any proposed rules. Can they necessarily block them because they're commenting on them? No, but they can at least comment on them. Now, after publication in the Federal Register, final regulations are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. And the Code of Federal Regulations is this reference work that compiles the regulations of all agencies in a series of volumes. The main thing I want you to take away from the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations is the amount of pages in them has been expanding dramatically, particularly over the past 100 years. Now, the problem is, I don't know how many of you have worked in government or have actually seen a government regulation, is even if you understood every single thing in a regulation or had read every single regulation, trying to figure out how to comply with regulations would be difficult if not impossible. And the reason is a regulation just says what an end state should be. So you have complied when your process at the end of the day looks like this. But you had absolutely no clue how to get there. Okay? And what they have done in response to this is most regulations have a form of guidance with them. And guidance is typically non-binding documents designed to clarify regulations. So what that means is you can read the regulation, you say, oh goodness, I have no idea what this means, what the text actually means, and I have no idea how to comply with the regulation. You can look at guidance, and it can say, well, these are some of the best practices that we as civil servants or government officials have noticed for corporations or individuals wishing to comply with federal regulation. Of course, another thing that you can do when it comes to guidance, or federal regulations, and you don't know what to do, is just contact the agency that puts out the regulation. there should be a point of contact on there. Email them, call them, say, hey, I don't understand this. This is my situation. What am I supposed to do? My experience has frequently been that they're happy to help. Of course, sometimes you have a grumpy civil servant, but generally speaking, they are happy to help. They'd rather you call and try to get the stuff straight than have to make them do all the extra work later because you have been negligent in understanding the regulation. Now, another thing that has occurred with regulation is presidential oversight. And presidents have always tried to control the bureaucratic machine, but they've met with very little success. They have some tools at their disposal to try to stem the amount of regulation. They can do executive orders. They can do moratoriums, meaning there will be no more additions to the regulations. Or they can appoint heads of agencies who are more friendly to a president's agenda and would be less inclined to do more regulation. Presidents can also cut the budgets of agencies to stop the amount of regulation coming out, and they can also have a central review of regulations at the White House. Congress also must approve presidential nominees of agency heads, and they can also make appropriations, or they can control the purse strings of different agencies if they feel that they are over-regulating. Now, conflicts in agencies are resolved in a couple ways. First of all, you got the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires agencies to set up an adjudication process leading to a trial before an administrative law judge. Furthermore, if a judge's decision fails to resolve the dispute, federal courts can review agency actions. So if there's conflicts between the people and an agency, you can resolve it through the courts, or if it's a conflict between agencies, that can also be resolved through the courts. Another part of challenges in courts is the Chevron doctrine. Now, this Chevron doctrine says basically federal courts should defer to agency rules, and these agency rules should be based on a reasonable, common sense interpretation of ambiguous statutes. Now, of course, common sense is anything but common, especially when it comes to government. Congress has allowed federal courts to hold hold as unlawful any sort of agency action that is seen as arbitrary, unfair, unconstitutional, in excess of agency jurisdiction, or unsupported by any sort of evidence. So Chevron doctrine basically encourages an agency to use some degree of common sense. Now, we should also think about the cost of regulation. Of course, the cost of regulation can be broken down into total dollar cost and also the cost of administering the regulatory process. Other costs of regulation, of course, are also large, but they're a little bit more difficult to quantify. So in our next video, we'll talk about some of the benefits of regulations and also the principles of good regulation. I'll see you then.